Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Humanitarian aid into Gaza has been obviously, a huge topic of late. I read a really interesting article, column in the newspaper a little while ago about airdrops, and so I thought I'd reach out to the author to find out a little bit more about what these airdrops are, whether it was going to solve the humanitarian crisis, and what the author's point of view on it was. Chris Houghton is joined me today. He is currently the faculty at the University of Toronto's Global Health Education Initiative. He's also the CEO of Humanitarian Associates. It's a consulting firm. He is the president of the Canadian Peace Museum Charity, and he's previously worked in humanitarian aid and logistics and leadership for Doctors Without Borders, the Canadian Red Cross, and the World Health Organization. So obviously a gentleman well experienced in and knowledgeable about humanitarian issues. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So what was this point of view that you were trying to make in regards to airdrops? You were arguing that airdrops are flashy but don't actually solve the problem. Is that
pretty much
what you were saying?
I mean, that is a perfect summary of what I'm saying, but perhaps I'll expand on that slightly. So
Please.
The World Food Programme in December last year raised the alarm that all of Gaza is in a food crisis. That's 2.2 million people. So what we have to consider is how much food do 2.2 million people need? The standard humanitarian pack of food would be 850 grams. So if 2.2 million people need 850 grams of food a day, you can do the math. It's like 1,800 tons of food a day. And we're about 150 days in. So that's the magnitude we're talking about. Almost 2,000 tons of food a day. Now, those airdrops that we saw, those planes were not fully loaded, but should they be fully loaded? Should those have delivered the absolute maximum that a C-130 plane could have? That would be 13 tons. So you can deduce from that, you need like 50 of those airdrops every single day just to deliver the food. Let's not talk about the water or the medicine or any of the other things, but just taking the food component of it, you would need 50 a day. The United States so far has done 2 ever. So you can see that it's a fraction. And the amount that they actually dropped, it wasn't a full plane load. I ran the math on it, it's 1.7%. So for one day. So every time the US does an airdrop, 1.7% of the population get fed for one day. It's a fraction. And overall, it's a fraction of a fraction. It's a distraction from the real need. It's not enough.
Got to be an incredibly expensive way to get food there as well.
You betcha. I mean, it's difficult when military planes are used to actually deduce the cost, because how do you attribute the cost? But generally, when you move an air cargo, it's hugely more expensive than moving it by road. Hugely more expensive. And it's terribly inefficient and terribly ineffective. Not to mention the danger. I said last week, when I was on CBC, I spoke about how it's dangerous. The parachutes can fail. And when they fail, those aid drops plummet to earth at a deadly rate. And that happened on Friday last week. A parachute failed. 5 people died. It's not an effective way to get aid to people at the best of times. But if they're in a crowded area, you can imagine how terrible that is. Let's talk about another aspect of why it's such a bad idea. If you don't have enough aid, which is absolutely the situation there, it has to be given out on the basis of need. Normally, you would have a humanitarian infrastructure that would do some sort of assessment, decide who needs aid the most, and distribute it carefully, safely, and accordingly. But guess what happens if you drop it out the back of a plane from the sky? Who gets to it first? The fastest and the fittest. It's inequitable, it's inefficient, it's expensive, and it's deadly. And it's a distraction. We're all seeing newspaper headlines and videos of dramatic airdrops that are feeding a fraction of the population on a fraction of a number of days.
So why'd they do it?
I cannot say what people's motivations are. The skeptic in me thinks that it is to be seen to be doing something. Maybe maybe it's done out of a false sense that it's of course I mean, let's not say it's not helping. It's helping in a tiny way, but killing people at the same time. Mis it's misguided at best. Let's be optimistic. Let's be charitable. It's misguided.
So what's the solution? We do have a humanitarian crisis. We do need food. What is the solution?
There's only the obvious way to get almost 2,000 of tons of food to people every day is by road. It's blatantly obvious that that is the way to do it prior to the restrictions on the flow of aid. According to Norwegian Refugee Council, who know what they're speaking about, 500 trucks would go in per day. And that has been massively reduced. And the answer is right in front of us. Allow the trucks to go in.
And why aren't they?
They're being blocked. And inspections by Israel and bureaucracy at the border is slowing the flow of aid.
I can't believe bureaucracy is slowing the flow of aid. There's got to be something more.
To say more than that would be to speculate on intentions, and we never know other people's intentions, but it's being blocked by Israel at the border.
So last week in the State of the Union address, Biden said he's going to build a pier. What's that all about?
Yeah, I've heard about that. So I've heard it described as a pier. I've heard it described as a sea bridge. It's a mechanism to deliver aid by sea. And based on what I've read online, that could indeed bring in hundreds of tons per day. So that's a bit different. Hundreds of tons per day, and now you're starting to deal with a significant percentage of the issue. But as I said at the start, just the food alone, you need almost 2,000 tons a day, and that would just to maintain it. Now that there's been a deficit, you would need a bit more than that. But I've read that would bring in hundreds of tons per day. Okay, let's celebrate that. But I also heard that that's 1 or 2 months away. Well, people are dying already. People are starving to death. We're deep into this. The alarm was raised in December. So is it a good thing? Okay, sure. Like, that would be nice. But it's months away. It's months away. It's not there yet. And again, the answer is there. 500 trucks used to go in per day. Now they are not. And people are busy inventing innovative solutions when the proven solution is in front of them. Bring it in by road.
From Egypt.
Yes.
Which is where it was coming in from, correct? Previously?
Yes.
And the border between Egypt and Gaza is controlled by Israel. Is that correct?
As far as I'm aware, yes. Now you're starting to get to the limits of my expertise. That, as far as I'm aware, but that I believe so.
And so your message to the world through your article was stop with the flashy stuff like airdrops, and let's figure out the fundamental solution to the problem, which is getting trucks across the Egyptian-Gaza border, correct?
Almost exactly how I would have said it. But what I would say is we don't need to so much figure it out as we need to apply diplomatic pressure to Israel to reduce the restrictions. That I'm not sure there's a whole lot of figuring out that needs to be done, because it worked before and it could work again.
We're chatting tonight about humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and specifically in regards to airdrops versus sea pier versus truck delivery of foodstuffs from Egypt. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with Chris Houston, or Houston, however you pronounce it. I apologize for that. Back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Chris Houston. He is currently with the faculty at the University of Toronto's Global Health Education Initiative. He's the CEO of Humanitarian Associates, a consulting firm. He's also the president of the Canadian Peace Museum charity. He's previously worked in humanitarian aid and logistics and leadership for Doctors Without Borders, the Canadian Red Cross, and the World Health Organization. Chris, maybe let's take a step back. Tell me how you got to this place. Doctors Without Borders, Canadian Red Cross, World Health Organization. What motivated you to get so involved in humanitarian issues like this?
back in the day, I worked as a consultant. I work as a consultant now, but I used to be a consultant a long time ago. And I had been traveling around Asia just before the tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck. And that struck not far from where I'd been traveling. And I felt compelled to try and help a place where my friends had been affected. And me and a friend from Sri Lanka and a friend from the Red Cross went to North Sri Lanka after the tsunami, and we took some supplies, we took some money, we did some help. We came back, and when we came back, I decided that that was one of the most rewarding things I had done, and I signed up to be a volunteer with the Red Cross and volunteered locally for a number of years, and then ended up leaving my profession and joining Doctors Without Borders and doing international work, which I just found to be a lot more rewarding than the consulting work that I'd been doing. So since then have worked in Papua New Guinea and Nigeria, the Somali region of Ethiopia. I've worked in Turkey on the Syria response. I've worked in Lebanon. I've worked in Pakistan. I've worked in Nepal, and most recently worked in Yemen.
What a fascinating background experience. You've got a bachelor's with Glasgow Caledonia University, a a degree or diploma or something like that from the Bain Academy in Strategic Thinking and Communication. Another one from International Development Innovation Alliance, Managing Innovation for Impact and Innovation, from the National Examination Board in Occupational Safety and Health, from Loughborough University in Water Supply and Sanitation for Precarious Situations. University of Copenhagen, Introduction to Global Health, Red Cross, Red Crescent Learning Center, from Shared Experience in Humanitarian Assistance. And then one that I really quite found interesting, the Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program, that was about the Ontario Core Indigenous Cultural Safety Anti-Racism Program. And then another one, Certificate in Arts and Heritage Management from the Université Bocconi. Is that correct?
I don't speak Italian, so I'm not even 100% sure how to say it, to be honest. But I can tell that you've been on my LinkedIn, and yes, you're right. Over the years, I've done a lot of. The only one of those is a university degree. A lot of them are shorter certificates, but yeah, I've delved into a number of things connected to both my humanitarian work and my efforts to launch the Canadian Peace Museum.
Now tell us about the Canadian Peace Museum that you're the president and CEO of.
Sure. I'll just be clear. It's a registered charity that's attempting to create the Canadian Peace Museum. The museum does not yet exist. We're in the fundraising mode. So I will tell you about that. I mentioned earlier that I had worked in a number of places affected by conflict, and Yemen was the most recent one. And let me tell you that those experiences are tremendously educational and very rewarding, but they're also very stressful and they leave you with mental injury, quite frankly, and they leave you with a really strong sense of perspective. And those experiences have also left me with a very strong appreciation of peace. And considering the topics we're speaking about just now, you might imagine that my desire to have a more peaceful world has never been higher. I believe that we need to promote peace and that we need to celebrate peace. And I find it interesting that many countries in the world that Canada might often look to as peers have peace museums, and Canada doesn't. We have a human rights museum, and we have a war museum, we have an immigration museum, and we have a number of other museums. But the United States has a peace museum, the United Kingdom has a peace museum, France, Germany, Spain, Belgium, Australia, Japan has many. They all have peace museums, and Canada doesn't have a peace museum. And I think that's a gap. And not only do I think that we should do it just because that is the common thing to do for many other countries, but Canada occupies quite a unique position here. Peacekeeping as a concept in the United Nations was really advanced by Lester B. Pearson and the Suez Crisis. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was predominantly written by a Canadian. Canada is not just an average country here, and Canada's made mistakes over the years, and those are worthy of reflection as well. But Canada has been significant in global peace and human rights efforts. We don't have a peace museum. Well, I think that's a gap, and I think it's a gap that we should be thinking about right now, because deaths from violence on the world are on the rise. Uppsala University in Sweden measures this. The most recent data, 2022, most conflict deaths in the world since the Rwandan genocide happened in 2022. Violence is on the rise in Canada. Gun violence is on the rise in Canada. Sexism is on the rise in Canada. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia are all on the rise. The urgency about speaking about peace and promoting community harmony is high, and I think it's long overdue that we have a peace museum in Canada.
You believe that sexism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, gun violence are all on the rise in Canada today?
It's not a belief. It's before making such statements, I've researched them and I can share the documentation. But the Canadian Commission for Human Rights has the one that quoted the Islamophobia and the anti-Semitism since COVID. Racism has been on the rise since COVID. The stats on violence in Canada comes from the government themselves, and I can share that with you as well. I'm not opining here. I'm quoting statistics.
Why? Why is it all on the rise?
Now that is probably beyond what I can comment on without speculating. But there seems to have been an uptick in these things since the start of the pandemic, and I don't know what is driving it. I'll hypothesize with you. I think the prevalence of misinformation is really affecting us in society just now, and I think the way that we use social media and the way that people use social media to influence us creates tensions, and I think minority groups are often targeted by social media efforts, and so I have a theory there, but earlier I was quoting statistics to you. Now I'm giving you an opinion. I think that we have a tendency to blame people for problems that are not necessarily theirs, and I think people like to use that sense of there's many challenges that we face in Canada, particularly economic challenges just now, and I think it's easy to target minority groups for them, and so I attribute social media and to that, and political rhetoric as well. I think politicians like to fracture us in society. I write a newspaper column in the local newspaper here in Bancroft. It's called Stories of Peace, and the first column I wrote quoted Ed Broadbent, who obviously passed away earlier this year, and I quoted his final speech in the House of Commons, where he spoke about how in Canadian society we have differences, and he said we have legitimate disagreements as a society, and he said we focus a lot on the 25% of things that we have legitimate disagreements about, but we don't spend much time thinking about the 75% of things that we all have in common, and I found that very persuasive and important. We group ourselves, I believe, in Canadian society, particularly fracturing on political lines, and we identify by the things that we disagree on, and I don't think we spend enough time thinking about the majority of things that we probably agree on, and I think that is one of the reasons that we don't have more peace and more harmony in Canadian society, and I think we should. When I look at the society in the United States, it seems more fractured than Canada, and I hope we don't go in that direction. And I believe that promoting peace would be a helpful way to keep Canada, a cohesive, community-spirited country.
Well, I'm very worried that we're going to go the way of the United States. So I'm interested in your topic. What would the Canadian Peace Museum do to potentially alleviate this or combat that or set a different point of view out there?
So contemporary peace museums often just focus on non-violence and non-war, anti-war, which are good things to deal with. But sometimes what they miss is the positive side of peace. So academics think about peace in two ways. Negative peace is the absence of violence. Positive peace is all the other things that advance peace and make more peaceful society. So equity, inclusion, environmentalism, planetary health. These things are all drivers of peace. When we have a more equal society, then we have a more peaceful society. And so the Canadian Peace Museum aspires to indeed be anti-war and of course be anti-violence, but also speak about planetary health, about community cohesion, about Indigenous truth, about truth and reconciliation between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, but also reconciliation between other parts of Canadian communities that are fractured just now, to promote art and health and show all the links between these things. So these things are often dealt with in isolation. We're not commonly thinking about how climate change drives conflict, and yet the scholars who study this would tell you that if you take the Syria conflict, water shortages in rural Damascus was a factor. Now, not a huge factor in the Syria conflict, but it was a conflict. If you study the conflict in Sudan, which has been going on in South Sudan, it's been going on for some time. Again, water shortages is changing the movement of people and the animals that they care for and putting people in tension. So for example, the links between climate change and conflict are not well understood. The links between peacefulness and gender equality are not well understood. It's sometimes understood that gender equity is a consequence of peace. It's not so much understood that gender equity is a driver of peace. And so what we wish to do is make people reflect on peace and what drives peace, and promote peace, cherish peace, and understand the linkages between these different things that are often dealt with in silos, and bring them together.
I think it's wonderful, everything you say, but isn't it a little bit idealistic in a world where, we've got trench warfare in Eastern Europe for the first time in, since World War II. We've got, on October the 7th, the largest death of Jewish people since the Holocaust. And then in response, 20,000 innocents slaughtered, died in Gaza as Israel tries to find and eradicate Hamas. Some people would say the opposite, that the way you get peace isn't through all the things that you just listed, but by having an incredible military deterrent.
I think that with time, peace tends to have come from dialogue. And I think when you start to get into issues of the right for self-defense, then that's when it's difficult to have short answers to such complicated questions. But I'll say this much, that peace comes from dialogue and it comes from understanding, and wars do end, and when they do end, peace comes, and it's our job to accelerate that part of it as quickly as possible. So is it idealistic? Perhaps. If you want to call me an idealist, then I won't take it as an insult. But I will say that we need to promote peace more, and all the things that you just said are not reasons to not do this. They are reasons to do it, and we need to promote peace more than ever. And is it idealistic? Yeah, and I'm all for it.
So in response to peace through strength, you would say peace through dialogue.
Yeah, dialogue, respect for each other, understanding each other, understanding what drives the conflicts, understanding what disagreements, what causes disagreements. I'm certain that dialogue is the road to peace, and that we need more of that. Look how quickly, when there's a tension, countries move to war. Look how much the conversation is about war. Notice how the conversations around war are driven by men, and consider the burden that women bear in terms of pushing for peace, and how they're war always seems to be started by men, and the burden of peace work is overwhelmingly women's work, and the inequity around that. Yeah.
What about Canada? You have said that Canada has cut funding to some important organizations that are forefront of this effort for humanitarian aid and peace.
Canada paused funding to UNRWA, which is the United Nations agency that does the majority of the work in Palestine and then Gaza. Last week, they announced that they are resuming funding. That announcement came out Friday or Saturday last week, and that was the right decision. Now, we have to say, why did they cut it? They cut it because there was a very serious allegation made against UNRWA staff. Humanitarians must be neutral. And yet, Israel accused 12 UNRWA members of participating in the horrendous acts of the 7th of October. That is absolutely at odds with humanitarian principle. Humanitarians cannot take part in violence. That is an exceptionally serious allegation. That cannot happen, and that must be investigated. Now, what we've heard, that there are multiple investigations ongoing. What we've heard is that those staff have had their employment terminated. In fact, from what I read online, at least 2 of them have died, were killed. So those that are accused have been terminated. Investigations are ongoing. They have not concluded. In the meantime, 2.2 million people are relying on humanitarian aid. And so Canada paused new funding. That was the announcement a few weeks ago. And then at the weekend there, they said they would resume funding. And that is the right decision, in my opinion.
We're chatting tonight with Krista Houston about humanitarian aid into Gaza, but also about Canadian Peace Museum and peace, whether you get peace through strength or through dialogue or both. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Chris Houston talking about humanitarian aid and peace. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Interesting conversation tonight with Chris Houston. He is a humanitarian expert. He's CEO of Humanitarian Associates, a consulting firm. He is president of a charity called the Canadian Peace Museum. He's talked to us a little bit about how we don't have a peace museum, other countries do, and he thinks that that's an important step that we should take to celebrate Canada's role in peacemaking in the past and also to challenge us. And he's challenged us in regards to what he says is an increase in sexism and racism and violence and armed violence, gun violence, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in Canada. All pretty negative statistics when we think about our society. If Chris is right and he says he's got the facts to back him up in that regard. But what we were talking about to start with is the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Chris. You spent some time in Yemen recently, and you also spent some time previously in Syria. Maybe take another step back, if you could, and talk about the Middle East, and tell everyone, if you could, remind everyone, if you could, where Yemen is, where Syria is, where Gaza is, and what your experience has taught you about that part of the world.
So, in 2017, I worked for the United Nations, the World Health Organization, in Yemen during the conflict, a food crisis, and the world's biggest cholera outbreak. I've not worked in Gaza or Palestine, which are often referred to by humanitarians as the occupied Palestinian territories. And I ran operations. Tried to run operations in Syria from across the border in Turkey. We were not tremendously successful at that time because the conflict was so raging that we struggled to get access. I'll speak about these are all countries in the Middle East. The Yemen is in the Gulf. It's just south of Saudi Arabia and east of Oman. And when I was there in 2017. It felt like desperate times. The war was raging. The country was divided, as it still is, and there
Civil
was
war has been going on in Yemen for a long time, correct?
Correct, and I wish I had the numbers to hand here, but close to 10 years. It's been raging, and it was a war. It's a siege. There was a tremendous challenge because the port of Hodeidah on the west coast of Yemen was blocked by the Saudi-led coalition, and Yemen, like Gaza, a country that heavily relies on the importation of food, and the restrictions on that port were having a devastating effect on Yemen at the time. So there was a food crisis. There was violence from conflict. Healthcare system was collapsing. The entire economy was collapsing because of the conflict, which meant that the government in the north was unable to pay wages, and so healthcare systems were collapsing. I was head of logistics for the World Health Organization. It was my job to bring in the medicine and medical supplies for the entire nation, and nations require hundreds of tons of medicine to be imported. So I don't want to do too much. Oh, woe me! But it was tremendously stressful for me. And I only spent 6 months there. You know, the stress that the population felt would be off the scale. But yeah, we were for the most part shipping in medicine and medical supplies, and flying in medical supplies when they were urgent, which is urgency is the order of the day when you have a cholera outbreak. Cholera is a disease that dehydrates people, and 50% of the severely affected will die very quickly if they don't get rehydration fluids. So we're flying in plane loads of rehydration fluids, and very difficult to fly in planes in a conflict zone. You have to negotiate with both sides to agree what they call deconfliction, which is like a mini ceasefire, where they both agree not to shoot the plane down, and then land the plane, quickly unload it, get it out, in the window that you've got. Very stressful times.
And Syria, tell us about Syria.
So Syria, I was deputy head of mission for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and in Syria, and that was ultimately another very difficult time because we struggled to get access. The Islamic State had just taken over the area where we were trying to work, and we could not negotiate access, and so we were doing not very much for some time other than enabling a tiny trickle of aid, and then everything changed because then the Kurdish population, which live in an area of North Syria that the Kurds call Kobani, and in Arabic is called Ain al-Arab. The Islamic State took over there and pushed the Kurds out, and hundreds of thousands of Kurds came into the south of Turkey, and many of them were fine, and many of them were not, and they really had the urgent need for emergency shelter and a place to stay, and then as soon as you have a mass population movement, they have lots of urgent needs, including water and sanitation, as well as shelter needs and clothing and food. So we went from not achieving very much to urgently distributing things that people need, and instigating the construction of water and sanitation facilities. So washrooms, a place to wash clothes and showers, etc.
And where are those Kurds today? Are they still in Turkey, or have they returned to Syria?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't know. I worked there some time ago, and my ability to track exactly what happens with those people movement is beyond me. So I don't know. Sorry.
It's interesting that you've got so much religious strife, racial strife, ethnic strife in that area. It's how do you solve that?
I I'm not an expert, and I will go back to hypothesizing, but I think dialogue, I think people can live in harmony. I think you can live in harmony when you have dialogue with people who disagree with each other. I mean, there's plenty examples of different ethnic groups and different religions living in harmony. And I'm sorry if this doesn't sound like a particularly insightful answer, but dialogue, equality, cooperation, I do believe is the answer to these things.
Some people think that Canada can be a great example to the world with diverse populations, where Toronto is more diverse in its diversity than almost any other city in the world, and Canada, with all of its immigration, is more diverse than the United States is, and the U.S. Brags about its immigration and its diverse founding. But yet you've described that Canada is got some challenges. You say that sexism, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, gun violence, etc., are on the rise.
Mhm.
Is Canada still an example, or have we lost that?
In global scale, Canada is still at the high end of peacefulness and democracy. I mean, you're speaking to an immigrant, right? Like I came here as an adult myself. I have lived in almost all continents of the world, and I'll tell you, I've been to over 50 different countries. I love Canada. I chose Canada, and I chose it for its peacefulness. So yes, those things are on the rise, but they're not comparable to the places that we've been speaking about. I think Canada's a overall tremendously peaceful country. We can point to trends going in the wrong direction, and we can point to examples, but we need to keep perspective. Canada is an exceptionally peaceful and harmonious country, and the reason I pointed those things out is it's starting to change in a negative situation. But yes, I think the answer to your question is absolutely yes. It is a diverse, peaceful, wonderful nation that I chose as an immigrant here myself, and that I love, and I'll tell you, I chose it for its peacefulness. It means a lot to me. The peacefulness, both in terms of the lack of violence in Canada, but also the beauty of Canada as well. I'm in Bancroft just now. I'm looking out the windows as we speak, and the rain's coming down. But I was walking the dog earlier. You know, it's beautiful. It's beautiful in four seasons. So let's keep perspective.
You know, humanitarian aid, it almost seems like something that never ends. There's always a need everywhere for food, for medicine. Doctors Without Borders has been around for a long time. Aid organizations, the United Nations, etc. Will it ever end? It just seems like it's a nonstop, never-ending demand for food, for medicine, for water. Is there
I mean,
ever a solution here?
Doctors Without Borders was founded in 1971. So you're right. We're 53 years in by my math. Um, Needs are on the rise. But again, let's speak about perspective. How much money do we spend on humanitarian aid? Less than we spend on chewing gum as a globe, and less than we spend on ice cream as a globe. So chewing gum and ice cream don't make the news so much, but in terms of how much money is spent on humanitarian aid in a global sense, it's rather small. And yet the needs are high. At this point in time, 1% of the population is forcibly displaced. And I'm really glad that we're speaking about it, and I'm really glad that you're interested in it. But frankly, as a globe, we don't really prioritize humanitarian aid. But to speak about humanitarian aid is to speak about water when the problem is fire. So the problem is not the size of humanitarian aid. The problem is the size of global conflict or the gaps in services. I mean, what the world needs is peace and equitable government. And wealth equity and lack of violence. So let's not lament the size of the humanitarian system. Let's lament the prevalence of violence or the prevalence of inequity. That's what we need to work towards. If we think there's too much humanitarian aid, then just all we have to do is solve the violence. No, there's the magnificently large problem in front of us. Is how do we push for a more equitable, more peaceful world? Well, that takes a lot of effort. But I appreciate you giving me the chance to promote the Canadian Peace Museum as one tiny fraction of that. I mean, I think this is one endeavor that we're trying to do here, and I hope that many more people feel that working towards peace might be something we should all be spending a bit more time on globally.
You've worked with the United Nations, you've worked with Red Cross, you've worked with Doctors Without Borders. Is humanitarian aid too fragmented, or is having the different organizations trying to address the need actually helpful?
I really appreciate this question, actually, because I think it's a really important issue that I do have thoughts I'd like to share on. Right. So is it too fragmented? The real thing, Brian, is too small, right? I made the analogy yesterday, a few moments ago about how we spend more money on chewing gum, how we spend more money on ice cream. The problem with the humanitarian system is like any system, pick any system, and you'll find gaps and there'll be critiques of it, and there's plenty critiques of the humanitarian system. However, the main issue is it's not big enough. The main issue is is absolutely insufficient for the scale of the problem. Is it fragmented? Well, here's the thing: organizations are different. They have different ways of working. Let's compare two big organizations. The Red Cross, it has a way of working in the sense that it respects national sovereignty. It will never do anything in a country that the legitimate government of that country didn't want. Now let's compare Doctors Without Borders. It'll break the rules. If they don't get visas to a country and people really need stuff, they will break the rules and they will cross that border anyway and do work. And as a result, they're able to get places that the Red Cross doesn't get to go. And because of the Red Cross commitment to respecting the rules, they will get to go places that Doctors Without Borders won't get to go. They'll be invited into the prisons to help people because they will be diplomatic. They will not speak out about it, or they will do the diplomacy behind closed doors. MSF are noisy. They won't get invited in there. So it's good that there's different organizations. It's good that they're working different ways. Some of them are able to do some things, and some of them are able to do other things. Is it too fragmented? No. Is it too small? Yes, that's the real issue. It's like I made the fire analogy earlier. If we gave a firefighter a water pistol and asked them to a building on fire and then critiqued how they did it, they would say, do you know what, Chris? The main problem here is not my technique, it's the lack of water. And that's the dilemma with the humanitarian system. It's tiny compared to the size of the problem. When 1% of the world is forcibly displaced just now, the humanitarian system is at breaking point, and that is the conversation we need to have.
Okay, let's go back to Gaza. So you say there needs to be 50 trucks a day driving into Gaza from
500 trucks a day. I said 50 airdrops, but 500 trucks a day is
500 trucks a day.
Is what was going to be.
And there's trucks are there because they were going into Gaza at one point in time. How do we get the foodstuffs to Egypt? Is that coming through via ship to some port in Egypt?
I don't know, to be honest, but the blockage is at the border. The blockage is the result of the checkpoints by Israel. If you ask me what is the solution, it's to apply diplomatic pressure to speed up those checkpoints, like it was before. 500 used to go in a day before, and just now they're not. So
we also saw some trucks getting trampled by people. So there's got to be some sort of a distribution system once you get into Gaza to make sure that you don't have rampaging crowds that trample other people as they try to get the goods. So do we have that system in Gaza to actually distribute the goods?
I want to say something about that. We are all one hungry child away from jumping the line, from stealing from the supermarket. If any of our children were on the brink of starving to death, we would all do whatever it took to get food to that child, and desperate people can do desperate things. However, this is a separate conversation from the border. Are we blocking things in because we think that the humanitarian charities cannot distribute aid in a way? That's what they've been doing for decades the world over. They want to go in, So I really want to separate that. The difficulty in doing distributions, and I've done distributions and I've done them well and I've done them wrong. There's a way to do it, and a way that you need to do it that is safe, and it's difficult. However, let's not pretend that anybody's stopping them at the border because they're concerned about the safety of the humanitarians that want to. The humanitarians are wanting in, and they're ready to do it. So let them.
Okay, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is there is a system to get the food into Egypt by air or by ship. There is a system with 500 trucks to get those trucks to where the foodstuffs have come in to the border. And there is a system, albeit maybe some challenges, to distribute it once it's in Gaza. So the one problem is crossing the border. Is that correct?
That's my assessment. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm seeing.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments with Chris in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Interesting, but scary and depressing conversation all at the same time. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had a really interesting conversation tonight with Chris Houston, or Houston. He is currently on the faculty at the University of Toronto Global Health Education Initiative. He's the CEO of Humanitarian Associates, a consulting firm, and he's president of the Canadian Peace Museum charity. We've talked about some of his experiences in Yemen, in Syria, in Turkey, around the world, with the Red Cross, with Doctors Without Borders, with the World Health Organization. This gentleman has really seen humanitarian aid internationally. And he's also talked about Canada and some of the challenges that we've got in Canada with growing hatred, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, gun violence, etc. So it's been a challenging conversation, and yet Chris is still idealistic and hopeful that through dialogue and through the Canadian Peace Museum and through other efforts, we can improve the situation. But Chris, you've got, in addition, I understand, a personal experience with PTSD from your experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think it's good to speak about these things, even though it is a topic that can be difficult to speak about. But yes, the time that I spent in Yemen, where bombs were falling and the abduction risk was real as well, left me with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm sad to say that is not uncommon amongst my peers who have worked in conflict zones. Took me a while after returning from Yemen to realize that that's how it had affected me. But that was the last time that I did international aid work, 2017. And I've been on a road to recovery since then, and it's under control thanks to medication and therapy, and reflection and space. And yeah, I live with that to this day. Now, at this point in my life, it has a trivial effect on my life, but that has been years to get to this point. And like I mentioned earlier, that's somebody who spent 6 or 7 months there was left with that. I dread to think how much the mental health burden affects people who live through it for years. People who don't have the privilege I had to work for United Nations, to drive around in a armor-plated car, to live in a building that had armed guards around it. They have a much more difficult life than me, and I dread to think the prevalence of PTSD amongst the population in Yemen or Syria or Gaza to this day.
I have a niece that worked with Doctors Without Borders in Africa. I've got a future daughter-in-law who's worked in Ghana. No other people that have worked worldwide. Given the challenges that you've identified in our globe, the organizations, albeit fragmented, that are addressing it, your PTSD and your challenges, is it something you'd recommend to people to think about?
Oh, there's a good question. And the short answer is yes. The short answer is yes. I have post-traumatic stress disorder that's affected me ever since after working in Yemen, and I wouldn't change any of it. I think when I die, the most, and I reflect, as I'm dying, I'll reflect back on my life. I do not think I'll ever be able to do more for humanity than that experience I had in Yemen when we moved in hundreds of tons of medicine. Probably the most rewarding, personally satisfying thing that I have ever done. And yes, it took a massive toll on me. And if I was given the choice to do that again, I would take that choice to do it again. Because it's worth it, So what I think I would advise people is go in with your eyes wide open to this. Take care of yourself. Try to advocate for employers to create working environments that are as conducive to good mental health as possible. But frankly, the work that I've done overseas, I work for United Nations, by the way, that pays well. I work for Doctors Without Borders, that does not pay well at all. And yet it is the most rewarding work that I've ever done, and I would thoroughly recommend it. But I'd also advocate to people who employ humanitarian organizations to do the maximum that they can do to take care of the people prior to going overseas in terms of preparing them for this, in terms of their treatment and the safety that they provide for people overseas, and in terms of the care afterwards. And this conversation could easily move into a conversation about the quality of mental health care in Ontario in Canada, because mental health care is different from broken leg care. We treat mental health differently, and we don't fund it as well. And I could easily move into a whole big conversation around that. But there's a personal responsibility that people need to have. There's an employer's responsibility, and then I feel like the healthcare system doesn't serve people with mental illness as well as it does as people with physical illnesses. And I'd like to note that.
Chris, given what's happening in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Yemen, in so many other places around the world, and the statistics that you spoke about in regards to Canada, are you hopeful right now, or are you pessimistic?
Both. I'm both. So you're right. You listed many conflicts, and Myanmar and Sudan and DR Congo are all front of mind as well. But then we could list all the places in peace, and there's many, many more. They just don't make the news. We could speak about how peaceful it is in Iceland just now, but it doesn't make for such an exciting conversation. We could speak about, yesterday was International. Sorry, this will be going out next week. We could speak about the recent International Women's Day, International Women's Day, and the referendums that Ireland had to advance women's rights on that day. The world is improving in many, many ways. And I emphasize Canada is tremendously peaceful and lovely and beautiful. And the way that we live our lives is we speak about the problems, and we focus on what's going wrong. And there's a hell of a lot more countries that are living in peace and where human rights are increasing, and we can point out the mistakes. But actually, the reason to have a peace museum is also to celebrate the good, and to recognize that peace is the standard, is the norm. I'll tell you a quick story, if I may. We had an event promoting the museum. We had an academic drive-in from Ohio to speak about peace. And he took a look at the room and he said, there's 75 people in this room. He said, if you all stood shoulder to shoulder, it would be a line 150 feet wide. If that line represented the history of mankind, the amount of time that people were at war is the width of a fist, 4 inches wide. The other 149 feet in the inches is the times that we lived in peace. Peace is normal. Peace is the way that people have tended to exist all throughout history. And we can look at Ukraine and Gaza and the examples that trouble us just now, and we should think about them. But it's not the norm. It's never been the norm, and it's not even the norm to this day. Peace is normal, and we need to not forget that.
Does the Canadian Peace Museum have a website people should go to check out?
It does. CanadianPeaceMuseum.ca.
Chris Houston, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. This has been an interesting conversation.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Bancroft, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are put up on my website, briancrombie.com, and social media as soon as they go live on the radio. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Chris. Good night.